Hello everybody and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. This video is all about the Manchurian Crisis of 1931. This video goes through the causes of the Manchurian Crisis, the events of the Manchurian Crisis and the consequences as well. Starting off, we're going to have a look at the causes of the Manchurian Crisis. And with this in mind, we kind of want to be aware of exactly where we're referring to when we're talking about Manchuria. And if you take a look at the map that's on the left-hand side there, you'll see that area, which is kind of in that, I was going to say that lightish peachy colour, but a lot of it is. But you can hopefully see using the key there, we can notice that that area there is where Manchuria is. And essentially, Japan was very interested in this territory. Japan was very interested in expanding its territory into Manchuria because, as you can see, as of 1928, Japan not only had their own territory, but also they occupied the land that is nowadays seen as Korea as well, which Manchuria bordered onto. In the early 1930s, Japan is going through quite a stage of turmoil. During the 1920s, Japan became very internationalist. It was very interested in working through with other countries and negotiating with trade and so on and so forth. But when the Great Depression hits, they become a lot more isolationist. And a group that starts to become very powerful in Japan is the IJA, the Imperial Japanese Army. And they're represented for us here in these pictures with the image on that top right-hand corner. So before we get into actually Japan invading Manchuria itself, we're going to have a look through the actual background in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, the early 1930s was a really difficult time for Japan, and that was because of how badly they were suffering from the consequences of the Wall Street crash of the 29th of October 1929 and the Great Depression as well. Now, as I'm sure you are aware, Japan is not alone in its sufferings from the Great Depression. It is an international problem. Pretty much every country in the world was suffering from these problems. And what essentially happens is that at a time of crisis like that, rather than looking towards being cooperative and helping each other out, countries actually become very selfish and quite isolated. And that is exactly what was going on with Japan. Now, many believed, especially in the government that was being really highly influenced by the Imperial Japanese Army, many believed that expanding Japanese territory into Japan would help them out economically. And the main reason for that was that it would help give them another place where they could sell their products. During the 1920s, Japan was able to make a lot of money by selling rice around the world and also the luxury product of silk as well. However, as soon as the Great Depression hits, countries aren't really interested in importing products like that anymore. So that's why they need these other places to be able to sell their products. Now, as discussed previously, Manchuria wasn't just some random location that they chose. We can see that it borders onto the territory that they already have with Korea there. So it made sense for them to be able to expand into this area. And not only that, back in 1904, Japan was allowed to have soldiers in North Manchuria guarding the railway line there. And so there was kind of a bit of a vested interest in Japan being able to expand into there. But the problem is that Japan needed a reason be able to take over Manchuria. They couldn't just kind of swan in there and decide, hey, we're going to be in charge now. They needed a reason to be able to occupy that territory. And I was going to say, luckily for them, something came up. But actually, as we'll see, the reason for their invasion isn't actually as clear-cut as they would have liked it to have been. The invasion of Manchuria happens in September 1931. After there is an explosion on the railway line that Japan is overseeing in the town of Mukden. And Japan blame this explosion on the railway line on the Chinese. They say it is sabotage of the highest order. Okay, so they use this as the excuse that they need to invade. But the problem is that actually there wasn't really any evidence to suggest that an explosion had actually happened. If you imagine an explosion happening on a railway line in our country here, you would imagine there would be, for instance, at least a little bit of disruption to the running of trains and how long it was taking for trains to run. But actually, there's no evidence that that happened on the Manchurian Railway. But nonetheless, Japan used this as their reason to invade. And following on from the explosion in September 1931, they invaded Manchuria with their army. Again, it is referred to as the Imperial Japanese Army. What's important to note here, however, is that the Imperial Japanese Army, the IJA, invaded Manchuria without the permission of their government. And by this stage, the Imperial Japanese Army seems to be exercising a lot more power than the Japanese government themselves. So this is essentially the actual, how can we say it, the trigger of that invasion of Manchuria. So this is the causes behind the Manchurian crisis itself. Let's take a look at the events of the Manchurian crisis. Essentially, the crisis begins in September 1931 when that explosion on the railway lines at Mukden takes place and the Imperial Japanese Army invades Manchuria, literally days following it. China does exactly what you would expect any country to do with the League of Nations on hand. They make a phone call to them and say, Japan have invaded our territory, can you help us out? And the League of Nations say, yes, we'll help you. And what we're going to do is we are going to send out the Litton Commission. Okay, the Litton Commission will go over to Manchuria and will decide exactly what is going to happen. And as many of you will know from studying the Manchurian crisis, this commission that is sent out by the League of Nations, headed up by Lord Lytton from Britain, takes a year to come up with its conclusion. And this is essentially what the Litton Commission came up with in that year. So Japan had claimed that they were going over into Manchuria because China's rule there was chaotic and Japan were there to restore order. And the Litton Commission decides that yes, that seems to be a pretty accurate description of what was going on. The Litton Commission decides that yes, China's rule is chaotic in Manchuria and that Japan was only there restoring order. However, the Litton Commission did also decide that Japan should be morally condemned for the invasion. The decision about what should happen to Manchuria was merely a suggestion. Okay, it was merely a suggestion. It wasn't a direct situation. This is exactly what is going to happen. It was a suggestion. So the suggestion they made was that neither Japan or China should be allowed to rule Manchuria, and instead it should be its own self-governed state. That's what the Litton Commission decided. In terms of punishments, as well as using their moral condemnation, the Litton Commission decided that there would be no economic sanctions placed on Japan. That's what they essentially decided when the commission went over there. And again, it took them a year to come to this conclusion. So let's just summarise the events of the Manchurian crisis that we've just been looking at here. The Chinese were very quickly defeated by Japan when they went in to invade at Mukden. And the army was now in control of Japanese policy and not the government itself. China appealed to the League of Nations for help, and the League sent the Litton Commission out to look at the evidence. It took a whole year for the Litton Commission to come back and publish its report, where it suggested that Manchuria should be independent of both China and Japan. Japan essentially ignores all of these instructions. It ignores the moral condemnation that took place. And of course, as we've just said, there were no economic sanctions. And we'll talk about why that was the case in just a second. So they ignore all of those ideas. And by early 1933, remember that initial explosion on the railway line takes place in September 1931. The Litton Commission takes a year, so that brings it forward to 1932. And then by early 1933, Japan have decided that they have taken over the whole of Manchuria. So the League's decision has been completely ignored. It feels now is probably a pretty good time to remind ourselves that Japan was one of those 4 permanent member countries of the Council of the League, that VIP club of the League of Nations. So interesting to see how the League reacted to one of their larger powers acting in this situation. Let's take a look at the consequences of the Manchurian crisis. We're going to look at some immediate aftermaths first of all, and then we're going to have a look at it in terms of the weaknesses of the League that we can see in this Manchurian crisis. As mentioned just beforehand, Japan takes over the whole of Manchuria, despite the fact that the League of Nations recommends that Manchuria should be an independent location. Japan completely ignores that. And as well as that, they also take over the neighbouring province of Jehol, which you can see on the map just there. It's just to the left of Manchuria. Ultimately, the Manchurian Crisis demonstrated that the League of Nations was a failure, especially when trying to deal with a permanent member of the Council of the League, that VIP club of the League of Nations. Something should have been done about Japan. Japan committed an act of aggression and something should have been done about it, but they were absolutely allowed to get away with it. There were no punishments put in place on Japan. They morally condemned Japan, but essentially they completely ignored that ruling. And economic sanctions were not used against Japan because their main trading partner in the 1930s was America. So any economic sanctions that they put in place would have made absolutely no difference whatsoever. We see a lot of selfish leadership from Britain and France at this time. Britain and France were also suffering from the consequences of the Great Depression as well. And because of this, they were not prepared to risk war or sending their troops as far away as Japan. Also, Britain at this time very much didn't want to disrupt any trade links that it had with other nations in Asia. All of this soft treatment towards Japan, was designed to make sure that they stayed in the League of Nations. But that completely backfired. And in late 1933, Japan left the League of Nations. The cartoon that you can see down in the bottom, on the bottom there, is a really good example of Japan's lack of respect for the League of Nations at this time, despite them trying to do everything they possibly could to save face in this instance. The images here really demonstrate the weaknesses of the League that are highlighted in the Manchurian Crisis. First of all, we can talk about the fact that the League lacking an army was a massive problem here. The Imperial Japanese Army had gained a lot of power in the early 1930s, and a lot of historians believe that the only way another country would have been able to deal with the Imperial Japanese Army would be by meeting it with an equal matter of force. But remember, the League of Nations doesn't have an army of its own, and nobody was prepared to supply any troops at this time. America's absence from the League was also a problem, because it meant that those economic sanctions just would not work. Had America been in the League of Nations, then the economic sanctions would have been a lot more powerful. The moral condemnation and the economic sanctions, again, the fact how badly they failed, demonstrates how weak those punishments were, that nobody really cared if the League of Nations told them off because they knew with that lack of an army, there wouldn't be any backup for it. And finally, again, as we've just been mentioning, that selfish leadership of Britain and France during the Manchurian Crisis. They should have been the ones to stand up against a permanent member of the Council of the League of Nations and actually tell them when they were doing something wrong. But remember, in the Corfu incident back in 1923 with Mussolini, when Italy, another permanent member of the Council of the League, went against the League ruling, they didn't do anything then. So again, we're demonstrating this idea of that preferential treatment, that favouritism for those members of the council, and especially on behalf of Britain, that was really more so focused on its own interest in to do with trade in Asia. We see a lot of selfish leadership going on of the League of Nations, which is a massive failing and a massive weakness we see in the Manchurian Crisis. One of the significant consequences of the Manchurian Crisis is the fact that it gives other leaders across the world the idea that the League of Nations won't necessarily stop them if they take over other countries. And one person in particular who thought this was this guy here, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, the leader of Italy at this time, the same guy who was the leader of Italy during the Corfu incident in 1923. He sees what happened in Manchuria and thinks, Japan got away with that pretty easily. This gives me an idea. And that will lead us beautifully onto the next video in our League of Nations series, which is going to look at Mussolini and the Abyssinian Crisis of 1935. Thank you so much for your time in watching this video today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. Don't forget to like the video if you did find it useful, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well, so you'll get updates in terms of when new videos are released. Remember, you can always follow me on Twitter and Instagram. You'll find me there at One History Help, and you can also find me on Facebook too, again, just by searching One History Help. Thanks again for your time today, everybody, and I'll see you again very soon.